The arena suddenly falls silent. Thousands of eyes lock onto you as the Emperor slowly rises from his throne, but nobody explains why. Instead of announcing a battle, the Emperor points directly at you. If your freedom depended on surviving whatever comes next, would you step forward or try to run? Because every gaze is fixed on you, there is nowhere to hide. Therefore, you tighten your grip on your sword and walk toward the iron gate opening beneath the arena wall. The tunnel promises answers, but it only grows darker. Therefore, every step echoes louder until an unfamiliar roar shakes the stone beneath your feet. The roar belongs to a massive lion waiting behind another gate. But the animal is not charging. It is staring at something deeper inside the tunnels. Because the lion fears something, you look beyond it. Therefore, you notice a hidden passage that should not exist beneath the Colosseum. The secret passage could be a trap, but it could also be an escape. What would you do if freedom suddenly appeared where nobody was supposed to find it? Because staying guarantees another fight, you choose the unknown path. Therefore, you enter a forgotten network of tunnels buried beneath ancient Rome. The tunnels lead away from the arena, but fresh footprints appear in the dust. Therefore, you realize someone escaped this way before you. The trail suddenly ends at a sealed stone chamber, but carved symbols on the wall hint that the greatest battle of your life may not happen inside the arena at all. Because the symbols must mean something, you trace them with your fingers. Therefore, a hidden mechanism awakens beneath the floor, and the sealed chamber begins to open. The chamber reveals no treasure. Instead, it contains abandoned armor, rusted weapons, and evidence that generations of gladiators secretly gathered here. Because others stood where you stand now, their story suddenly feels connected to yours. Therefore, you search deeper, hoping to learn how their struggle ended. The evidence reveals a hidden rebellion, but every clue points to a devastating truth. None of them ever reached freedom. Because every previous attempt failed, escape now seems impossible. Therefore, a distant metallic sound instantly captures your attention. The sound grows louder with every second. Therefore, you realize Roman guards have discovered the hidden entrance above. The guards block the path behind you, but another tunnel stretches forward into darkness. Could you trust a route nobody has ever survived? Because capture means returning to the arena in chains, you sprint into the unknown passage. Therefore, the chase begins beneath the heart of Rome itself. The tunnel twists violently through ancient foundations. But the faster you run, the more the air begins to feel fresh. Because fresh air means an exit, hope surges through you. Therefore, you push harder until the tunnel suddenly opens into a forgotten underground river. The river offers a possible escape route, but the current is dangerously strong. Therefore, every second spent deciding allows the guards to get closer. Because there is no safe choice left, you leap into the current. Therefore, the river immediately drags you into darkness. The current pulls you farther from the arena than any gladiator has ever traveled. But something enormous moves beneath the water beside you. As the shadow rises closer, moonlight suddenly appears ahead. Therefore, you realize the river may finally be leading you out of Rome. The exit is finally within reach. But the creature beneath the water is about to reveal itself. Therefore, your fight for freedom is far from over. Because the shadow is closing the distance, you force yourself toward the moonlit opening. Therefore, you finally break through the surface and gasp your first breath of open night air. The fresh air feels like victory, but the river suddenly explodes behind you. Therefore, you turn and finally see what followed you through the darkness. It is not a monster at all. Instead, a massive crocodile thrashes through the water before disappearing back into the current. Because the river carried you beyond the city, the guards can no longer be seen. Therefore, for the first time in years, silence belongs to you alone. Freedom feels close enough to touch, but a faint glow appears across the hills. Therefore, curiosity pulls you toward it before dawn arrives. The lights belong to a hidden settlement, but the people watching from the shadows are armed and clearly do not trust strangers. Because you carry a gladiator's armor, they mistake you for a Roman hunter. Therefore, every movement you make could decide whether they welcome you or attack. An elderly survivor steps forward and notices the scars earned inside the arena. What would you think if someone carried proof of every battle they had survived? Because they recognize your suffering, the tension begins to fade. Therefore, they reveal a secret that changes everything. The settlement is filled with escaped slaves, deserters, and fugitives, but they are not hiding anymore. They are preparing for something far greater. Because Rome continues to expand its power, these people dream of building a free community beyond imperial reach. Therefore, they ask whether you will help protect it. The offer promises belonging, but accepting it means abandoning the chance to disappear forever. Therefore, you spend the night questioning who you truly want to become. As dawn approaches, the answer finally becomes clear. Therefore, you realize freedom is not simply escaping chains. It is deciding what comes after them. Because your decision is made, you return to the settlement ready to help. But urgent news arrives before you can speak. Roman scouts have discovered the settlement's location. Therefore, the freedom you just found may soon face its greatest test. Because the scouts now know where the settlement is, every minute matters. Therefore, the entire community begins preparing before the Roman army can arrive. The settlement is brave, but it cannot survive a direct assault. Therefore, you search the surrounding terrain for an advantage the Romans might overlook. Because the hills are narrow and steep, a large army would struggle to move through them. Therefore, a dangerous plan begins forming in your mind. The plan could save everyone, but it requires standing against Rome one final time. Therefore, you volunteer to lead the defense yourself. Because people finally have someone willing to fight for them, fear begins turning into confidence. What would you feel if dozens of lives suddenly depended on your decisions? The preparations continue throughout the day. But as sunset approaches, dust appears on the distant horizon. Because the dust belongs to Roman soldiers, the moment everyone feared has arrived. Therefore, the settlement falls silent as the enemy advances. The Romans expect frightened fugitives, but instead they find a prepared resistance waiting inside the mountain pass. Because the pass restricts their numbers, the Roman advantage disappears. Therefore, the battle begins on equal ground. The first wave is pushed back successfully, but more soldiers continue arriving. Therefore, exhaustion begins becoming as dangerous as the enemy. Because the battle cannot continue forever, you search desperately for a decisive solution. Therefore, your eyes fall upon unstable rocks above the pass. The rocks could block the entire pass, but reaching them means crossing directly through the most dangerous part of the battlefield. Because there is no other option, you sprint toward the cliff. Therefore, every enemy suddenly focuses on stopping you. The climb drains every remaining ounce of strength. Could you keep moving if failure meant losing the freedom of everyone below? Because you finally reach the summit, the chance still exists. Therefore, you place your weight against the largest boulder and prepare for one final push. Because every second counts, you throw your entire weight against the boulder. Therefore, the stone finally shifts and the mountain itself begins to move. The first boulder crashes into the pass. Therefore, dozens of smaller rocks break loose behind it, creating an unstoppable avalanche. Because the pass collapses completely, the Roman advance is shattered. But the ground beneath your feet suddenly begins to crack as well. The victory is real, but now you are trapped on a collapsing ledge. Therefore, survival depends on escaping before the mountain gives way. Because the ridge continues breaking apart, there is only one path left. Therefore, you leap toward a narrow outcropping hanging over empty space. Your hands barely catch the edge, but the stone beneath your fingers begins crumbling immediately. Because letting go means certain death, you force yourself upward despite complete exhaustion. Therefore, you drag yourself onto solid ground one final time. The battle below slowly fades into silence. Therefore, you look down and realize the settlement has survived. Because the Roman army can no longer reach the valley, hope finally replaces fear. Therefore, people emerge from hiding and begin rebuilding immediately. For years, these people survived by running. But tonight, they celebrate something they have never truly known before. Because they see you as their protector, they invite you to lead them. What would you choose if freedom suddenly came with responsibility? The offer carries honor, but leadership was never your goal. Therefore, you spend the night considering what freedom truly means. Because your entire life was controlled by others, the answer arrives unexpectedly. Therefore, you realize freedom begins with the ability to choose your own path. The arena once defined who you were. But now the chains, the battles, and the emperor feel impossibly far away. You entered the story as a gladiator searching for escape. Therefore, you leave it as a free person who finally controls their own future. Because the future is finally yours to choose, you begin walking beyond the valley. Therefore, every step feels different from the marches once forced upon you. The road ahead is uncertain, but uncertainty no longer feels frightening. Therefore, curiosity replaces the survival instinct that ruled your life for years. Because the world suddenly seems larger than the arena ever allowed, you begin noticing details once ignored. Therefore, every village, river, and mountain feels like a discovery. Days pass peacefully. But one evening, a familiar sight appears far across the horizon. Because the empire still exists, countless others remain trapped within its reach. What would you feel knowing your freedom came while so many still wait for theirs? The thought stays with you through the night. Therefore, your journey slowly transforms from escape into purpose. Because experience has taught you what oppression feels like, helping others becomes impossible to ignore. Therefore, you begin sharing your skills wherever people need protection. The battles become smaller than those in the arena, but their meaning feels far greater. Because people begin sharing stories about the wandering gladiator, your legend quietly spreads. Therefore, strangers start recognizing the symbol carved into your old shield. Fame was never the goal, but it opens unexpected doors. Therefore, invitations arrive from communities seeking guidance rather than rescue. Because people now look to you for wisdom, you finally understand how much you have changed. Therefore, memories of the arena begin losing their power over you. Years ago, survival was the only thing that mattered. Could you have imagined this life while standing alone inside the Colosseum? Because the answer is no. Gratitude quietly replaces regret. Therefore, you stop measuring life by battles won and start measuring it by lives improved. The empire remains powerful, but its shadow no longer controls your future. Therefore, every sunrise feels like a reminder of what was once impossible. And as you continue walking toward another unknown horizon, one truth remains clear. Freedom was never waiting at the end of the journey. It was created by every choice you made along the way. Because every choice shaped the person you became, the road ahead feels lighter than the one behind. Therefore, you continue forward without needing to know exactly where it ends. The path leads into unfamiliar lands, but unfamiliarity now feels exciting. Therefore, each new horizon becomes an invitation rather than a threat. Because your story continues beyond the battlefield, new friendships form where old enemies once stood. Therefore, the world gradually feels less divided than before. The scars remain on your body, but they no longer remind you of suffering alone. They remind you of survival. Because survival gave you a second chance, every ordinary moment feels valuable. Therefore, simple things begin carrying extraordinary meaning. Years pass quietly, but one day news arrives from a traveler coming from Rome itself. Because curiosity still lingers inside you, you listen carefully. Therefore, you learn that the emperor who once controlled your fate is gone. The revelation brings no celebration. Instead, it reminds you how temporary power can be. Because empires rise and fall, the things that truly matter become easier to see. Therefore, your thoughts return to the people whose lives changed because you refuse to surrender. The arena once seemed larger than life, but now it feels small compared to everything that came after it. Because your greatest victory was never defeating an opponent, you finally understand what the journey was truly about. Therefore, peace becomes the reward you were searching for all along. The world continues changing around you, but your purpose remains simple. Help where you can and keep moving forward. Because every ending becomes the beginning of something else, another road eventually appears ahead. Therefore, the familiar feeling of adventure returns once more. You pause for a final moment and look back at everything that brought you here. What path would you choose if your future belonged entirely to you? The answer is yours alone. Until our next journey together, keep chasing the horizons that call to you. And perhaps the next adventure is already waiting just beyond the road ahead. Because the road ahead remains unwritten, you follow it without hesitation. Therefore, every step becomes proof that your life finally belongs to you. The journey no longer feels like an escape. Instead, it feels like the beginning of something larger than you ever imagined. Because freedom gave you perspective, you notice struggles others overlook. Therefore, helping people becomes as natural as breathing. The gratitude of strangers brings unexpected satisfaction. But it also reminds you how many people still live without choices. Because that realization stays with you, your purpose becomes clearer. Therefore, each destination matters less than the lives touched along the way. Years ago, survival demanded constant vigilance. Could you have imagined a day when peace itself felt normal? Because peace was once unimaginable, you never take it for granted. Therefore, even quiet moments carry extraordinary value. The world continues changing around you, but the lessons learned inside the arena never completely disappear. Because hardship shaped your strength, you no longer resent the past. Therefore, even painful memories become part of the path that led here. The farther you travel, the more stories you collect. Therefore, your journey becomes woven into the journeys of countless others. Because every person carries a different burden, compassion becomes your greatest weapon. Therefore, conflicts often end before a sword ever leaves its sheath. The arena taught you how to fight, but freedom taught you when fighting is no longer necessary. Because wisdom often arrives slowly, you finally recognize the true reward of your journey. Therefore, gratitude fills the space where fear once lived. The road stretches onward beyond sight, but instead of wondering where it ends, you simply enjoy where it leads today. And as another horizon appears in the distance, a familiar feeling returns. Therefore, you smile and keep moving forward, ready for whatever story waits beyond the next hill. Because every road eventually reaches a turning point, this one finally brings you to the edge of a vast plateau. Therefore, you stop for a moment and take in the world that once seemed impossible to reach. The view is breathtaking, but what moves you most is remembering who stood here at the beginning. Therefore, memories of the frightened gladiator return one final time. Because that person refused to surrender, every moment afterward became possible. Therefore, you finally understand that freedom was earned long before the arena gates ever opened. The mystery from the beginning is finally answered. The emperor stood because he believed your story would end inside the arena, but the true story was only beginning. You are no longer a gladiator fighting for freedom. You are a free person living it every day. Thanks for sharing this journey, and if you want to experience another adventure together, follow along for the next story waiting beyond the horizon.